Hello once again, this is Uncle Jimmy with Jimmy's Train Station and Travel Adventures, and today I'm doing kind of a part 5 to the John Wilkes Booth escape route, except part 5 is a conspiracy theory that John Wilkes Booth actually escaped from the Garrett farm and was not assassinated or killed by the Union Army and lived another 40 years in Texas under the alias of John St. Helen. So I'll let you decide and judge for yourself. I will give you all the evidence and then you can judge for yourself. But right now I'm standing in Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm at the Booth family plot. And let me show you around here. Now, John Wilkes Booth is supposedly buried in an unmarked grave here in the family plot. Now, the plot's not that big. Right here we have the grave of Joseph A. Booth, born February 6, 1840, died February 26, 1902. And right beside him is his wife, Cora. Now, this is the grandparents of John Wilkes Booth. Now, over here we have Richard Booth, which is the father of John Wilkes Booth. We have Rosalie Booth here. I believe that's the wife or one of the daughters. I think it's the wife of Richard Booth. Here we have John Wilkes Booth's sisters, two of them. And this is Mary Ann. And this is her footstone. People at that time had footstones that was rich or had money. They had a headstone and a footstone. How you doing? Good. Now, this is actually the footstone of John Wilkes Booth's sister. A lot of people mistake this as John Wilkes Booth's grave, and it isn't. This is just the sister's footstone that's buried right here. But people leave pennies thinking it's John Wilkes Booth. Now, he's buried in an unmarked grave, so more than likely Booth is buried in this area or behind the Booth monument. But I'd say probably right in here is where Booth's buried. So follow me on this adventure and I'll tell you about how possibly John Wilkes Booth may or may not be buried here and may have survived another 40 years in Texas under the alias of John St. Helen. I'll show you the evidence, you judge for yourself. Follow me. All right, let's get started on this adventure today, and we're going to be discussing, we were at the Baltimore Cemetery of Greenmount Cemetery and visited the final resting place, or supposedly resting place, of John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. And this is part 5. This is a little different than I usually do. We're just going to be discussing the evidence that John Wilkes Booth might have survived and not been killed at the Garrett farm and lived another 40 years in Texas under the alias of John St. Helen. Now, I'm not saying this is true, this conspiracy, or that it really happened. I mean, there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there, just like Billy the Kid survived and Elvis is still alive, which I know Elvis is not alive, and the Kennedy survived, and just all kinds of crazy theories. But this one here seems to have a lot of evidence. So I'm kind of in the air on this one. I mean, I'm thinking maybe it could be true, maybe it couldn't be true. I'm not saying that it is true, but to be honest, myself, I am going a little more with it could have happened. So I'm a little more on the thinking it happened but I can't say for sure. The only way we will know is through DNA. That's the only way we're going to get the answer to this, if it really was a government conspiracy or a government cover-up. So I'm sitting here in the old train station, and I was thinking about this today. I haven't done a train model for a long time. So maybe I'll do a video soon of building another HO scale train model. The one I was planning on building is this one here. The next one, it's called Brody and Martin Cole, and it's from false scale models. And I love false scale models when it comes to train building and kits. They're really good kits, and if I suggest you get into that hobby, that you order from false scale, they're not really pricey. They're usually anywhere from $30 to $50, which is normal for a model train. So let's get started here and talk about this a little bit. Now we're going to start out at the scene of his supposed death. So let's start at the scene of his supposed death, which was April 26th at 4 a.m. at the Garrett Farm in Virginia, where he supposedly was hiding. John Wilkes Booth was hiding along with David Harold, one of his accomplices. Now, together, they were at the Garrett Farm. They were tipped off. A cavalry detachment of the Union Army was tipped off by an unnamed group or unnamed person that John Wilkes Booth and David Harold was hiding on the Garrett Farm in the barn. So we're going to start there, and I'm going to tell you the evidence and everything that's happened over the years since then, and I'm going to let you judge for yourself. So let's start there. Now this, I'm going to put out in front of you pictures of these people, some of the people that I was able to get pictures of. So let's take a look at, first, let's take a look at a picture of John Wilkes Booth and pictures of David Harold. So let's do that right now. So the first set of pictures was of John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln, and the second was of David Harold, who was with him at the time. Now, okay, so the cavalry detachment surrounds the farm. They're surrounding the barn completely. It's an old tobacco barn, and the old tobacco barns had slits in them every 2 or 3 feet of the boards, where it could air out when they hung the tobacco and it could dry quicker. So it was that type of barn. It was a tobacco barn. Now, like I said and showed you, there's nothing there today to even show an existence of a farmhouse or a barn. Too bad that we lose stuff like that to history. But that's just the way it is over 150 years. You're not always going to have or be able to save famous spots like that. So this cavalry detachment was under a Lieutenant Edward Daughtry. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. It's Doherty, Daughtry. And what Daughtry does is he's under strict orders by the government to take Booth alive. Not to kill him, but to take him alive. So Lieutenant Daughtry, after having his men surround the bar, hollers out, "John Wilkes Booth, come out with your hands up. You are under arrest." So he waits a few minutes, nothing happens, and then a couple hands come out the barn door saying, "Don't shoot, don't shoot." And that was David Harold. Now, David Harold gave himself up. He come out giving himself up. And the story goes that Booth wouldn't surrender, or supposedly the person in the barn wouldn't surrender. And so Daughtry grew impatient and gave the command to smoke out the barn. So he had the soldiers light torches and set fire to the inside of the barn, and to smoke out whoever was in the barn, which they were thinking it was John Wilkes Booth. So let me show you a picture here of a couple gentlemen. But first, there's an anxious sergeant there, and his name was Boston Corbett. Well, he grew impatient, this cavalry private did, Boston Corbett, so he took matters into his own hands, and he stuck his rifle inside between the two boards of the barn, and with the light of the fire, he could see the silhouette of the person in the barn. So he took aim, shot the gentleman in the neck, and then two other soldiers went into the inferno and pulled out the body to the outside of the barn. So with that said, let me show you a picture of the lieutenant that was in charge of the cavalry, and also of Mr. Corbett, the private, who took aim and shot the supposed John Wilkes Booth. So let's look at that now. So that was a picture of the lieutenant who was in charge of the cavalry detachment, and also of Boston Corbett, the man famous for shooting supposedly John Wilkes Booth. Now, let's start with all the evidence here and see if it was a government cover-up or a conspiracy. So let's examine the evidence. Now, this is known evidence and known facts, and have all been written down in affidavits and stuff, that all this happened. So let's start when David Harry come out of the barn. It was said by a couple cavalrymen people passed down through history. Now this is written down but not proven, but they heard David Harry when he come out, he said, "That is not Booth in the barn. It is not John Wilkes Booth. The man in the barn is Boyd." So let's examine this character called Boyd. Boyd was a lieutenant in the Confederate Army, and he was wanted at the time in the state of Maryland as a fugitive, and that was because he murdered the killing of a Captain Watkins in Maryland. So he was. Now here's the weird thing. He was a prisoner of war at the time, and Stanton, for some reason, this is proven in documents. This has never been done before. This is weird. Stanton ordered his release and brought him to Washington, D.C. slightly before the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And, slightly after, a day or two after, or right before Lincoln was assassinated. Now, this is weird. I'm not sure if it was right before or after, but he brought him to Washington. Some say he was brought there to use as a spy for the Union, that he gave his alliance to the Union Army and was going to be a spy. And it's just weird that Stanton would do that and release him. But this Boyd somehow was in the conspiracy with Booth on the whole conspiracy theory to assassinate President Lincoln, and was known to hang and be with him at the time of all this planning and all this happening. So it's said that Booth was warned like 2 days or a day before the army actually surrounded the barn that the army was about 12 miles away, and he was warned by some Southern sympathizers at the Garrett barn that he should move along because the army was getting close. So that's when Booth left the barn, supposedly. And while he left the barn, he had dropped his journal, his diaries that he was using at the time. And he had met up with Boyd and had Boyd go back to the barn to recover his journals. Now, the story said that if it was Boyd in the barn, he had John Wilkes Booth's journal on him, which obviously, when they brought the body out, assumed or went ahead and decided it was John Wilkes Booth because he was carrying John Wilkes Booth's diary. Now, the story gets a lot more weird here. It gets crazier as the story goes along, but it's got pretty good evidence. So before we go any further, now this guy called Boyd, which was a James Boyd, a lieutenant of the Confederate Army, who was brought to Washington, like I said, looked a lot like Booth. It's amazing how close he resembled Booth, except he was lighter complected and had lighter hair. So first of all, let me show you a picture of Captain Watkins. That's the guy that this Boyd had murdered. And then I'm going to show you a picture of Boyd himself. And look at the familiar face and look how much close he looks like Booth, and how they could have used that as a cover-up to fool the Americans that it was Booth's body. So let's take a look at these pictures, and then we'll be right back. Amazing, huh? Looks a lot like Booth. So this could be possibly the body that's buried in the Booth family plot. Possibly. If Booth really escaped. So let me give you some hard evidence here. During that time, there was a Lieutenant William C. Allen. Fortunately, I do not have a picture of him, but he worked for the U.S. Secret Service in 1865, and he was at the Garrett farm at the time they pulled the body out. He was standing there, and he had told the colonel, and who was standing there, at the Garrett farm. He looked down at the body and he said, quote, "This man is not Booth. This man has red hair," unquote. In August of 1937, Allen's widow, Lieutenant Allen's widow, told a journalist, Mrs. Hannah Allen was her name, said that her husband said they knew it wasn't Booth, but the government was going to voice this man off as a nation that it was Booth because they were too embarrassed that they couldn't find Booth and Booth got away. That was in a signed affidavit that his wife had told that happened. Also, there were two other soldiers there at the time. There was in the detachment, there was a Private Joseph Zitsu and a Corporal Quartermaster Wilson McKenzie. Now, I have no pictures of them either. But they were friends of Booth in 1862 and 63 in New Orleans. So they knew Booth very well and knew what he looked like. They said in front of the other cavalry soldiers they seen on a road off the side of Garrett Farm. They were talking to each other, and some other soldiers heard the quartermaster telling Joseph Zitsu, he said, quote, "They got Booth, except it's not Booth. It doesn't look like Booth," and nobody will believe me. So he was a quartermaster and had free will to come and go anywhere he wanted to. And in 1922, at 77 years old, he signed the affidavit of what he's seen at Garrett's farm. Along with Private Zitsu, he rode up to the body in the wagon and pulled back the blanket and said, "Hey, Sergeant, come here. This isn't Booth. This man has sandy hair, and Booth had very dark hair." He said, "I knew it at once. It wasn't he. His body was exposed, the lower part of it. He had no injured leg that I could see." And then another officer rode up of higher rank and said, "You men move away from here. And nobody is to talk about this or what they have seen here. If they do, there will be dire consequences to pay if anyone tells the truth." Now, this is all written down here. And then in 1866, there was a Senator Charles Sumner. Let me show you a picture of Senator Charles Sumner real quick. Now, that was a picture of Senator Charles Sumner. In 1866, he argued with the reward of bounty of Booth should not be paid out. The men of the cavalry unit detachment, and of course the lieutenant of the detachment, did get the money. I can't remember. It was a big sum amount that would be equal to a lot of money today, and I can't remember the exact amount was paid out. He argued that there was not enough evidence to prove Booth's identity. That same year, Senator David Barrett of Kentucky, which I don't have a picture of, complained that he never seen any satisfaction evidence that Booth had been killed. And then in the early 1900s, John Shoemaker, General Counsel to the Department of the Army, which is a very important position to hold, wrote, "The evidence put forth by the general and the government to support the conclusion that the body was that of John Wilkes Booth was so substantial that it wouldn't even hold up in the court of law." So it makes you wonder, with all this evidence, and these people saying that it wasn't the body, it makes you just wonder if this wasn't a government cover-up. Now, the government autopsy was done at the Navy Yards on a boat much like the Monitor. I can't remember the name of the gunboat or the metal boat that the body was on. A physician that was quite acquainted with Booth, a Dr. John F. May, did the autopsy. He was in charge of it. He had removed a tumor on Booth a few months before the assassination. Now, he was under a lot of pressure not to say anything and to say that it was Booth. But as he was examining the body, let me show you a picture of him real quick. This is a picture of John F. May. So that's a picture of John F. May. He was the one who did the autopsy, in charge of. And this is what he said as he was doing the autopsy. His statement is on record in Washington Archives. Anybody can read now. Was held secret for over 70 years before it was released to the public. He stated, quote, "The corpse has no resemblance of the actor John Wilkes Booth," unquote. Quote, "He's freckled. I don't remember Booth being freckled," unquote. So there's another witness that was there and could identify the body and said it wasn't Booth. Now, here's some more weird things about it. There's no picture of the body or the autopsy. If the government knew it was Booth, don't you think there had been hundreds of pictures taken? But there are none. Why is that? I mean, even Jesse James had a picture of his body after the assassination of Jesse James. The family of Booth was not even allowed to view the body or come aboard. And they had a couple conspirators being held prisoner at the bottom of that boat. Why weren't they brought up to identify the body? They would have known it was Booth. They were being held on the same ship the autopsy was being done on. Now later, the body was later buried in secret in the basement of the old naval prison yard in Washington, where they did the hangings of the conspirators. And later in years, about 4 years later, the body was finally dug up and released to the Booth family for reburial. And of course, they didn't look at the body then. They just put the body, the government put it in a casket, nailed it shut, and gave it to the family for reburial, which they buried the body in the Booth family plot in Baltimore in Greenmount Cemetery. So this, whoever that body is buried in the Greenmount Cemetery. In 1865, the government finally shut the case. Now let's talk about if Booth didn't die, what happened to him? Who was he? Where'd he go? And how'd he hide out? How did he escape? Well, it's said that Booth had left the Garrett barn a day before and had dropped his journal, like I told you, and had Boyd return to get it. When the cavalry surrounded the barn, and Boyd had the journal on his person when the body was shot and brought out of the barn. In 1907, there was an attorney named Bates who published a book called The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth. And it does the account of his friend named John St. Helen of Texas. Now, before I get into this story, let me show you a picture of Mr. Bates, who wrote the book. And then I'm going to show you a picture of John St. Helen, the supposed guy who claimed to be John Wilkes Booth. So let me show you that real quick. Huh. Kind of resembles him. Makes you wonder a little bit, doesn't it? Well, here's the story. This gets interesting. In 1877, these two were friends. Well, Helen fell grievously ill, thinking he was going to die, made a deathbed confession to Finis Bates, his friend. He said, quote, "Finis, I have to tell you, before I die, my name is not John St. Helen. It is John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. If I die, tell my brother Edwin I am dead." Then he proceeded to tell him in depth a story of conspiracy in detail of how he escaped. Even the password that was used by Booth that no one would know except for the soldier on the bridge of Washington, the 11th Street Bridge of the Naval Yard that let him pass, or Booth. They would be the only two that knew it. But how did he know this? He said, "When I fled from Washington, from Ford's Theater after assassinating the president, I came to the 11th Street Bridge and gave the password. And that password was TB Road. And then they let me pass to meet up and escape with my friend John Herod." It's just interesting. And he went later on in detail of details only John Wilkes Booth would have known. And he told Fitness, and Fitness wrote this book. I have yet not been able to read the book, but I think I'm going to have to buy this book and read it myself because it's got me wondering. Now, on January the 13th in 1903, staying in a border house in Oklahoma, John St. Helen committed suicide by drinking a glass of wine laced with strychnine. The body was preserved, and with the strychnine made the body almost kind of mummified, like a mummy. In 1931, 6 Chicago physicians examined the mummy's body and recorded their findings in an affidavit which read, "There is a scar above the right eyebrow. It has a crushed thumb bone, right thumb bone, and it goes on to say that there's signs of the broken left tibia." Now, the funny thing about this is all these are wounds that John Wilkes Booth was known to have. The scar above the eyebrow was caused by a sword fight on stage in a play. The crushed thumb bone was caused by Booth dropping a piece of stage prop onto his thumb, help moving it. And then, of course, the legs broken from either the jump from the balcony after killing the president, or falling off the horse, which is another controversy we don't know, because he had told Dr. Mudd that he had broken it from falling off the horse, and it's very well known that Booth wasn't a horseman, so it could have happened that way. Now the funny thing was, this mummy of John St. Helen was given to next of kin, which was only his friend Fitness, who took the body. Now they're giving free mummies away. So he took the mummy and then later sold it. It's said that at one time the Henry Ford from the Henry Ford Museum was going to buy it for $10,000, but didn't end up buying it. But some other gentleman bought it, and until the 1970s, it went around circuses and fairs and things like that, carnivals, and being shown as the mummy of John Wilkes Booth, who was going by John St. Helen. Now, I'm going to show you right now some pictures of that mummy. Now, nobody knows what happened to this mummy. It just disappeared in the 70s. It could be sitting in somebody's private collection, a big private collector, or just be sitting in an attic or in somebody's basement. Nobody really knows what happened to the mummy. So let me show you a picture of that mummy real quick. Wow. What do you think of that? Kind of resembles John Wilkes Booth, huh? Well, to end this story, to finish up, I will let you know, a few years ago, the Smithsonian Institute proposed exhuming the body of the man killed at the Garrett's farm from the Booth plot. And the Booth family also agreed with them because of this conspiracy. I believe this happened in the mid 2010, 2011, somewhere around there. It went as far as the State Court of Maryland, which refused to have the body exhumed, saying there wasn't enough evidence to prove this theory that John Wilkes Booth disappeared and survived. Now, here's the thing. We don't even have to do this. There is an actual piece of vertebrae from the body that was pulled out of the Garrett farm, and that piece of vertebrae is sitting in the medical museum in Washington, D.C., the Walter Medical Museum, Walter Reed. That could be matched with Booth's brother Edwin's DNA, which he's buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery in Massachusetts. in Cambridge, I believe. So we wouldn't even have to dig up with Maryland's weird laws about exhuming bodies. We could dig up his brother in Massachusetts, who don't have the same law, and be done with this for good. Prove it's John Wilkes Booth or it isn't John Wilkes Booth. Give it to the test and let's see. Why aren't we doing this? Does the U.S. government want to keep it secret because they know? And it would be a big cover-up and embarrassment if it is true? I don't know. What do you think? Feel free to leave your comments and suggestions of what you think about this and let me know what you believe. I'll leave it up to you to decide. But I hope you've enjoyed this 5-part series of John Wilkes Booth and his escape route and the conspiracy that he could have survived. This is the end of the 5-part series. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you're watching this. Hit the little red box with the white arrow. It's absolutely free. All it does is help my channel grow, keeps me going, keeps me excited to give you these videos and stuff. And please share this post with other people or friends that might be interested in watching things like this. Give it a thumbs up. Feel free to leave comments, suggestions of other things you'd like to see in the future. Until then, go out and have your own adventures and enjoy life. Until then, this has been Uncle Jimmy with Jimmy's Train Station and Travel Ventures. Till next time, goodbye.